Competing Frameworks of Elder Abuse and Violence Against Women. In the following learning module, Dr. Patricia Brownell will discuss 3 different and sometimes competing frameworks that have been used to conduct research and develop policy on elder abuse. An understanding of these 3 frameworks and related issues will help to explain difficulties in using existing data to understand and promote older women's right to live free from abuse. This module contains 5 learning objectives. 1. Identify how the differing definitions within each framework are limited in their ability to adequately capture the extent and nature of violence against older women. 2. Develop an understanding of how the differing frameworks impact data collection and research methods. 3. Develop an understanding of how the differing frameworks impact policy and practice. 4. Recognize the human rights perspective as a preferable alternative to the other 3 frameworks. 5. Identify recommendations for addressing violence against older women moving forward. In this module, you will be provided opportunities to reflect on the information presented. When necessary, you may pause and start this video or refer to linked resources in the description box for further information as they appear. To open the description box, simply click on Show More below the video. At the end of the module, click the link below to be directed to a certificate of completion. The full biography of our presenter, Dr. Patricia Brownell, is available below. Now let's get started.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank the organizers and conveners for planning and putting on this really important conference.
To begin, our first learning objective is to identify how the differing definitions within each framework are limited in their ability to adequately capture the extent and nature of violence against older women.
One of the challenges looking at research to date on older women and abuse is that there are differing theoretical perspectives, I'm going to suggest, and differing social research frames based on different theoretical bases use different age cohort data and different variables and result in different and conflicting prevalence data.
Dr. Brownell describes 3 different frameworks that have been used to address elder abuse. The first is the Intimate Partner Violence Framework, or IPV for short. Within this framework, violence against older women includes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and psychological aggression, including coercive acts, by a current or former intimate partner. Although this definition acknowledges gender, it is not specific to older women. It also excludes financial abuse and does not include neglect. The second is the Active Aging Framework. For more information about the concept of active aging, refer to the description box. Within this framework, elder abuse is defined as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust which causes harm or distress to an older person. It can be of various forms: physical, psychological, emotional, sexual, and financial, or simply reflect intentional or unintentional neglect. In this framework, gender neutrality of the victim is assumed. This is a notable limitation because compared to older men, older women are differently and disproportionately impacted by elder abuse. The last framework Dr. Brownell presents is the Vulnerable Older Adult Framework. Within this framework, abuse of older adults refers to intentional actions that cause harm or create a serious risk of harm, whether or not harm is intended, to a vulnerable elder by a caregiver or other person who stands in a trust relationship to the elder, or failure by a caregiver to satisfy the elder's basic needs or protect the elder from harm. From this perspective, care dependency on the part of the elder is assumed. This framework, like that of active aging, is gender neutral. Now that we understand how elder abuse is defined in each framework, Dr. Brownell will discuss how these frames are used differently to conduct research in this important area.
Looking at intimate partner abuse, for example, as one of the theoretical perspectives that's used to frame research on older women and abuse. Old age may start at 30, 40, 50, or 60 or older. So depending on the age that old age starts, there's going to be a different prevalence rate found. The types of abuse that older and intimate partner abuse studies use are physical, sexual, and psychological. And this is from those of us who study aging and elder abuse, this is a pretty narrow set of variables to use in a study like this. The underlying theory, power and control, as we know.
Power and control within intimate partner violence is inherently gendered, with men typically inflicting violence upon women.
The second frame I'm going to call the active aging frame. Here, the age cohort for research tends to be 60 years of age and older. The types of abuse that are examined in these research prevalence studies include physical, sexual, psychological, financial exploitation, and neglect. So this starts to be a broader range of variables. Perpetrator categories: spouse, partner, adult children, grandchildren, other relatives, neighbors and friends, and caregivers. And the underlying theory I'm going to suggest of the active aging frame is ageism.
According to the World Health Organization, ageism is defined as the stereotyping and discrimination of individuals on the basis of their age.
Third, there's the vulnerable older adult perspective. Here, the age ranges from 65 years and older. Now, we're looking at a slightly older cohort. The types of abuse, same as active aging, but sometimes include abandonment and self-neglect. The perpetrator categories are the same as active aging, but can include strangers and sometimes self, and certainly caregivers. The active aging and the vulnerable older adult research projects tend to be gender neutral. They tend not to look at older women specifically. Sometimes in active aging, there's some inclusion of men and women in the sample population, not always disaggregated in the findings. In the vulnerable older adult studies, they tend to be gender neutral pretty much exclusively. And there's generally no prevalence rates reported in studies involving vulnerable older adults, particularly those in care facilities. The underlying theoretical assumption is the vulnerability of the victim, and that's a defining characteristic of these studies. Generally assumes cognitive impairment, but can also include physical impairments that lead to care dependency.
Now that we have a better understanding of how each framework is limited, we can move on to learning Objective 2 and develop an understanding of how the differing frameworks impact data collection and research methods.
As I was doing research for the discussion paper on the expert group meeting at the UN, and I was asked to please identify the prevalence of older women in abuse. And as I began to review the research, I realized that there were such many different prevalence rates that were identified, and I began to think about, well, why is that? So what are some of the prevalence rates that have been found by studies on elder abuse? They can range from 1 to 2% of older women up to 38% of older women age 60 and above. This is a huge range, with 1 to 2% suggesting something almost approaching negligible, small, and the 38% begins to look very, very significant. And I'm going to suggest that these discrepancies are due to differences in research theoretical frameworks, measures used, and samples drawn. Interesting that estimates of lifetime experiences of abuse for those very few studies that have estimated this remain fairly stable at 20 to 23 up to 27%. So that begins to look a lot more significant. So looking, first of all, at the IPV in older women, IPV studies that include older women in study samples show the lowest prevalence of abuse. And the definitional criteria limit perpetrator categories, as we know, to spouse, partner, dating partners. And the types of abuse are limited to physical, psychological, and sexual. Sometimes financial is included, but under psychological. The locations of abuse include home and community, not institutional settings. And the ages of sample participants are often limited to women up to age 49, the end of reproductive years. And there is a WHO study on domestic violence from an international perspective that was promulgated in 2006 that UN Women used to say, well, there is no elder abuse. And there is no abuse of older women. That just doesn't happen. And of course, the reason it was found in the study was because they didn't have any older women in the samples. In the active aging and abuse frame, studies in this framework include samples generally age 60 and above. So this includes community, older people living in the community, and it's generally limited to abuse in the community. The abuse can include, as we said before, physical, sexual, psychological, financial, and neglect, and it has a very broad number of categories of perpetrators. Finally, the vulnerable older adult abuse framework can include abuse in institutional settings like care homes and hospitals, as well as a community. Older adult subjects are often 65 years and above and have often physical and cognitive impairments. Perpetrators can include spouse partners, adult children, other relatives, formal and informal caregivers, and other residents of care homes and institutions. And this is something pretty new. The idea was if there was abuse in nursing homes, it must be perpetrated by the nurses or the aides. And in fact, some recent research shows that residents perpetrate significant abuse on each other. So what are the implications of these different frameworks? Low prevalence is found among older women in IPV studies. Older women, and think about it, older women are more likely to be widowed, so they don't live with spouse partners. High prevalence is found among older women in active aging studies. They tend to live with adult children, to be victims of financial abuse, and to be sometimes caregivers for impaired, abusive family members. So the women in this frame are not necessarily going to be care dependent, far from it. And there's an unknown prevalence among vulnerable elderly women in care homes and institutional settings. Older women in these settings are more likely to be considered unable to self-report abuse, to be unavailable for studies that require informed consent, and university-based studies require that there be subjects' consent, informed consent, before they're included as samples.
Turning to Learning Objective 3, we will now develop an understanding of how the differing frameworks impact policy and practice.
So what are the implications for policy and practice? Laws and services might be based on a prevailing stereotype of elder abuse. For example, adult protective services in the US, and I believe there's some APS programs in localities and provinces in Canada. Older adult protective programs that assume cognitive incapacity as a criteria for eligibility are not appropriate for intimate partner violence with older women victims. And DV services, assuming intimate partner violence, are often not appropriate for older women victims of adult child abuse. The woman is expected to leave the home, to enter a shelter, to keep their location secret in some cases, to participate in programming that's specific to spouse abuse. And older women might own their own homes that they share with maybe an adult child abuser, and why should they leave? In order to be safe, they might feel. And finally, the concept and impact of polyvictimization is not generally recognized in the elder abuse field yet. This is just starting. What is the cumulative impact of abuse across a lifespan of multiple abusers, of multiple types of abuse? And we really don't know that.
Polyvictimization of older women is defined as multiple co-occurring or sequential types of elder abuse by one or more perpetrators, or one type of abuse perpetrated by multiple others with whom the older adult has a personal, professional, or care recipient relationship in which there is a societal expectation of trust.
So what do professionals and policymakers need to know about interventions? In the IPV frame in later life, DV shelters often don't offer age-appropriate programs for older women. They can't often admit care-dependent victims. Law enforcement, an important partner with IPV services, might not be so helpful to older women who may resist reporting abuse by family members, a son or a grandchild or a daughter. And guardianships, which are not usually used in IPV, more often with adult protective services, are not appropriate for victims who have capacity. And finally, criminal and family court may minimize abuse of older women, although orders of protection can be helpful if used appropriately, and usually with older women with a counseling and support component, not often available in. So active aging in the community. Aging service programs can provide temporary assistance with meals, social programs like senior centers, interim home care, transportation, links to law enforcement that include a counseling component. Adult protective services can be useful in assessing capacity, screening in those victims who are eligible for these services, and the need for social services. This is a case management program. The community-based elder abuse programs, we have some in New York City that are really excellent, and they're just not that prevalent throughout the US, and I'm not sure about Canada, Australia, or the UK, but these can provide counseling and support groups. So some models of service developed through the DV network that are then tailored to older women. And faith communities can provide opportunities for outreach and abuse prevention, but the faith communities have limited capacity. It's not their main mission. It's main mission. Plus, if there are family members who might be abusive as well as the victim in the congregation, it becomes a very difficult issue for these communities. For the vulnerable older adult abuse, community-dwelling older women, APS services might be available. Some other countries are starting to develop APS-like systems. Singapore is one. China is looking at this in a different kind of form in cities like Singapore, and I believe some provincial programs exist in Canada, UK, and Australia. For institutionalized older women, there are ombudsman services in the US through aging service networks that are placed in nursing homes that are mandated to serve as the voice of older people. And some APS services are in jurisdictions that allow APS workers from the community to go into nursing homes. That's not really the norm. And for older women who really lack capacity, guardianships can be helpful. They can be abused, but they can also be protective as well. So gaps in prevention and intervention, this came out of the expert group meeting. Internationally, national legislative initiatives, when they exist, have been largely bifurcated between domestic violence and the aging or protective service approaches. Older women often fail to fit either approach, and when the problem is intimate partner abuse of older women, they might be referred to aging service programs that lack capacity for addressing domestic violence among elder spouse partners. Older women might not meet the eligibility criteria both for DV shelters and for protective services for the elderly if they're not physically or cognitively frail, and in the case of DV shelters, if they are. Consequently, again, older women victims of abuse are likely to fall between the cracks of bifurcated legislative and legal and practice systems. And in addition, again, laws related to abuse and neglect of older women by family members or formal caregivers may be legislated but not funded. We used to call that unfunded mandates in government. And so all of these create policy implementation gaps.
Let's take some time to reflect on what we have learned. When violence against older women is framed within three different and competing frameworks, research in this area becomes fragmented and results in conflicting prevalence rates. We know that research informs policy, and policy is enacted in practice. Therefore, if there is fragmentation and inconsistencies in research, this is likely to result in fragmentation and inconsistencies in responding to violence against older women. Let us look at an example of how these competing frameworks and associated issues may result in barriers to appropriate care for older women who are victims of abuse. Anaya is 76 years old and has been physically and emotionally abused by her husband ever since her adult son moved away 15 years ago. Anaya is capable of caring for herself, but feels responsible for her husband, who is now showing symptoms of dementia. She feels trapped and alone. What are the detrimental impacts of approaching violence against older women from a single framework? In Anaya's case, consider how each of these frameworks may impact detection of abuse, willingness to report, referral to treatment or services, availability of resources that meet cultural and/or spiritual needs. Feel free to pause the video and participate in this exercise. When you are done, press play and Dr. Brownell will share an alternative perspective for framing violence against older women. For our fourth learning objective, we will recognize the human rights perspective as a preferable alternative to the other three frameworks.
Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about a human rights perspective because those of us who have done volunteer work for non-governmental organizations or NGOs at the UN sites have tried to come up with a perspective or framework that we believe is more inclusive of older women as a whole, and we're able to report on in UN settings. And the UN does focus on human rights issues. So the human rights perspective uses a life course, not the life stage perspective. This is important because when we look at older women, we begin to look at cumulative disadvantages, cumulative rates of abuse, as opposed to stage-specific abuse.
Some studies have found an association between child abuse and abuse in later life, demonstrating the necessity of acknowledging the full life course in elder abuse and violence against women research and practice.
Settings can include institutional settings like care homes and prisons, as well as community. This perspective prioritizes race ethnic minority populations that are socially marginalized, so as not focused exclusively on the dominant cultures in a given society. The types of abuse can also include social isolation, social exclusion, and poverty. So now we begin to look at an even broader framework. The concept of older women as rights bearers and government as duty bearers can help to strengthen the rights-based perspective, with governments responsible for enforcing human rights of older adults, including protection against violence and abuse. It challenges the residual approach to social welfare policy provided by charity, not that charity doesn't have a role, but are probably not able to mount a significant program to address abuse. And it stresses the entitlements approach.
The entitlement approach. Older women, and in particular victims of abuse, are entitled to protections and resources provided or supported by government.
So how do we begin to frame abuse against older women as a human rights violation? The Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging states older women face greater risk of physical and psychological harm due to discriminatory societal attitudes. So not that men are not abused, but that older women, for a variety of reasons, are more vulnerable and not least because there are more older women in the aging cohort. The UN Principles of Human Rights for Older Persons says living a life of dignity free of abuse is an important human right of all persons, older people, including older women, emphasis on older women, and the Convention for the Elimination of all, CEDAW, all forms of discrimination against women, states violence against women is rooted in historical and structural inequality and power relations between men and women, focusing on women but no mention of older women.
Let's take another moment to reflect. Reconsider the case of Anaya that we previously presented. If a human rights perspective was applied to the problem of violence against older women, how might this aid in preventing the further abuse of Anaya? Consider the application of an intersectional lens and the entitlements approach in your response. Feel free to pause the video and participate in this exercise. When you are done, press play and Dr. Brownell will discuss her recommendations for moving forward with elder abuse research, policy, and practice. Lastly, Learning Objective 5 is to identify recommendations for addressing violence against older women moving forward.
So what are some recommendations on how to promote the interest of older women? And this is at the UN. We need to expand, and I would say with our governments in any country, expand the definition of perpetrators beyond spouse-partner to other family members and trusted others. Continue to define domestic violence of older women as a human rights violation. Challenge the marginalization of older women within society and within the international women's movement, because that movement was represented at UN Women, and boy, was that hard to get them to even think about older women. And ensure that voices of older women are included in all forums and discussions on women and domestic violence as is being done here. Obtain data on country level of abuse of older women aged 60 and above, or disaggregated by age and gender. This is so difficult to get from many countries. Include older women in documents on domestic violence and women. There are some documents that initially did not include older women. This is including the World's Women, Trends, and Statistics promulgated by DESA, but with some advocacy, this latest report does have some data on older women. Conduct outcome research on interventions for older women victims of abuse, including evaluation on legislation intended to protect older women from abuse. And we know that sometimes laws are passed and then no funding is provided, and it goes largely unaffected. And within the DV movement, expand the definitions of family violence beyond sexual and physical to include other forms of abuse that are more likely to be experienced by older women. This discussion of prevalence of neglect, abuse, and violence against older women is based on different and sometimes competing conceptual frameworks, and it's intended to demonstrate the difficulties in using these data to understand and promote older women's right to live free of abuse. In order to address the current fragmentation in services to older women and neglect, abuse, and violence, practice and research communities, I'm going to suggest, need to come together to address gaps in knowledge and practice, eliminate ageist stereotypes, and reflect a more holistic view of older women in society. And we're framing that as a human rights perspective. The DV service system should acknowledge older women and plan to accommodate them. Shelters should be culturally age and gender sensitive, and the APS service system may be appropriate for some older women who are care dependent and vulnerable, but certainly not all. Aging service systems can work collaboratively with law enforcement and with DV systems to address crimes against older women and those service needs of crime victims, particularly those committed by adult relatives. Professionals should be familiar with elder abuse and the various service systems that serve older women victims of neglect, abuse, and violence. And finally, we need to learn from those systems that exist.
Thank you for completing the learning module, Competing Frameworks of Elder Abuse and Violence Against Women. Click the link below to be directed to a short survey and a certificate of completion.